a small family restaurant on the outskirts of the city, where the scent of home-cooked meals replaced the sterile air of corporate success. He'd come seeking anonymity, perhaps even peace, but Nicholas Hale never expected his carefully constructed world to crumble with a child's tearful sob. Just 3 days earlier, he'd stood beneath dazzling lights accepting Fortune's Entrepreneur of the Year award, cameras flashing as he delivered his rehearsed speech about determination and control. Now, as he looked into the wide blue eyes of a little girl lost among the bustling tables, something long dormant stirred in his chest. "I'll help you find your mom," he promised, his voice gentler than it had been in years. But when he finally spotted the frantic mother weaving through the crowd, time seemed to stop. Her familiar silhouette, the way she moved, the curve of her neck, memories flooded back with crushing force. Then she turned, her eyes finding his across the room, and the name escaped his lips like a prayer. "Rose?" In that moment of thunderous recognition, as her expression shifted from relief to shock to something deeper and more complicated, Nick felt the ground beneath him disappear. And when his gaze moved between Rose and the little girl with blue eyes, his blue eyes, the truth hit him with the force of a collapsing empire. Before we dive deep into this heartfelt story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It's free, as your support helps us create more meaningful stories for you. Enjoy the story. The restaurant around them faded into a muffled blur. Nick stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs as the little girl ran to Rose, wrapping her arms around her mother's legs. Rose's face had gone pale, her fingers trembling as they stroked her daughter's dark curls that matched his own. How had he not seen it immediately? The shape of the child's jaw, the determined set of her small shoulders, even the way she tilted her head slightly when curious, all reflections of himself. Is she? The question died in his throat, too enormous to voice completely. Rose's eyes never left his, filled with a storm of emotions, fear, guilt, and something that looked almost like relief. "Yes," she whispered, the single word changing everything. "She's yours." The floor seemed to tilt beneath his designer shoes. Nick reached for the nearest chair to steady himself, his mind racing through calculations. The girl appeared to be about 4 years old. 5 years ago, he and Rose had been... His thoughts collided chaotically as memories of their time together crashed through the careful walls he'd built around that part of his life. "Her name is Lily," Rose said, her voice stronger now, protective. "Lily, say hello to Mr. Hale." The little girl, Lily, his daughter, peered up at him with innocent curiosity. "Hello," she said, her voice small but clear. "You helped me find Mommy." Something cracked inside Nick's chest, a painful fracture in the armor he'd spent years perfecting. "Yes," he managed, his usual eloquence abandoned. "I did." Rose's hand tightened on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetie, why don't you go sit at our table for a minute? I need to talk to Mr. Hale." Nick watched as Lily nodded and skipped away, completely unaware that her world had just shifted irreversibly, just as his had. When she was out of earshot, he turned to Rose, feeling heat rise in his face. 4 years, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. 4 years, and you never thought to mention that I had a daughter. Rose flinched, but her eyes remained steady. You had made your choice, Nick. Your company was taking off. You were traveling across continents making deals worth millions. The last thing you needed was... That wasn't your decision to make, he cut in, each word precise and sharp. You had no right to keep her from me. Around them, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm, oblivious to the earthquake happening between them. A server passed with plates of steaming food. Someone laughed at a nearby table. But Nick could hear nothing but the roar of blood in his ears. I tried to tell you, Rose said, her voice dropping to a whisper. When I found out I was pregnant, I called your office. Your assistant said you were in Tokyo and wouldn't be reachable for weeks. I left messages. I wrote letters. Nick's brow furrowed. "I never got any messages. No letters." "Are you sure about that?" Rose challenged, something flashing in her eyes. "Or did they just get filtered out like everything else that might have distracted the great Nicholas Hale from building his empire?" The accusation hit with unexpected force because somewhere deep inside, Nick recognized the truth in it. How many times had Victoria, his executive assistant, proudly informed him that she'd handled personal matters so he could focus on what was truly important? "We need to talk about this," he said finally, running a hand through his dark hair. "Not here." Rose glanced over at Lily, who was happily drawing on a paper placemat. "I get off work in an hour. We can talk then." Nick nodded, the businessman in him automatically calculating time and logistics even as his emotional world continued to fracture. "I'll wait." "You don't have to." "I'll wait," he repeated, firmer this time. "I've already missed 4 years. I'm not missing another minute." Rose studied his face, perhaps searching for the man she had known before ambition had consumed him. Whatever she saw made her nod slowly. "Fine," she said. "But Nick, she doesn't know about you. She doesn't know who you are to her. So please, until we figure this out—" The implication struck him with physical force. His own daughter had no idea he was her father. For 4 years, she had lived without knowing he existed. The thought sent a shard of ice through his chest, sharper than any business setback he'd ever experienced. "I understand," he managed to say, though in truth he understood nothing anymore. His world, so carefully constructed on foundations of control and predictability, had just been blown apart by a pair of innocent blue eyes. As Rose walked back to her duties and Lily continued drawing, oblivious to the seismic shift happening around her, Nick sank into a chair at an empty table. For the first time in years, Nicholas Hale, the man who controlled boardrooms with a glance, had absolutely no idea what to do next. The hour crawled by with excruciating slowness. Nick barely touched the coffee the waitress brought him, his mind tumbling through a kaleidoscope of memories he'd locked away years ago. 5 years. It seemed both a lifetime and merely seconds ago. Rose. Her name alone conjured a flood of sensations he'd fought hard to forget. The scent of her hair, like vanilla and something uniquely her own. The sound of her laughter, uninhibited and genuine in a way that had startled him the first time he heard it. How different she had been from the polished, calculating women in his corporate world. He closed his eyes, and suddenly he was back there, 5 years earlier, when Nicholas Hale had been a different man. Ambitious, yes, but not yet hardened by success. Not yet isolated by it. "You're crazy," Rose had laughed, her bare feet dangling over the edge of the pier, the summer sunset painting her skin gold. "You can't just buy an entire company because you don't like their coffee." Nick had grinned, loosening his tie, a rare moment of relaxation. "Watch me. Their CEO is practically begging for a buyout, and their distribution network is exactly what I need." "Always thinking 10 steps ahead," she'd said, but there was warmth in her voice, not criticism. She'd leaned over, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "Just don't forget to enjoy the moment you're in." That had been their beginning, a chance meeting at a charity gala where Rose was working as a server. She'd spilled champagne on his custom suit, and instead of the anger she'd expected, he'd been captivated by her genuine apology and complete lack of pretense. He'd asked for her number that night, surprising himself almost as much as her. For 6 beautiful months, Rose had been his escape from the cutthroat world he was rapidly conquering. With her, he could just be Nick, not Nicholas Hale, the rising business titan whose name was beginning to appear in financial publications. She'd shown him parts of the city he'd never seen, introduced him to hole-in-the-wall restaurants with food better than 5-star establishments, and taught him that sometimes the best business decision was to close the laptop and watch the sunset. And he'd fallen in love with her, deeply, completely, though he'd never actually said the words aloud. Then had come the call, the opportunity he'd been working toward for years, a chance to expand internationally, to transform his company from successful to legendary. All it required was his complete dedication, starting with 6 months in Tokyo. 6 months? Rose had repeated, her voice steady even as her eyes betrayed her pain. They sat in his penthouse, the cityscape glittering below them like a carpet of stars. And after that? Singapore, probably London after that. He'd reached for her hand across the sleek dining table. It's everything I've been working for, Rose. Her fingers had been warm against his, but she'd pulled away first. What about us, Nick? Where do I fit into this grand plan of yours? And there it was, the question he hadn't allowed himself to consider because he'd known the answer would hurt them both. You could come with me, he'd offered, but they both heard the hesitation in his voice. He couldn't give her what she deserved while pursuing his ambitions. He would be in meetings all day, networking all night. She would be alone in a foreign country, waiting for scraps of his time. Rose had always been perceptive. She'd seen the truth in his eyes before he could voice it. No, she'd said simply. I couldn't. That's not who I am, and we both know it's not what you really want either. Her smile had been sad but clear-eyed. You're going to change the world, Nicholas Hale. You need both hands free to do it. He should have argued, should have told her that she mattered more, that they could find a way. But ambition had already sunk its claws into him, and the siren call of success had been too loud to ignore. The next morning, he'd left for Tokyo. No dramatic goodbye, no promises they both knew he wouldn't keep. Just a kiss that tasted of ending and a whispered, "Take care of yourself, Rose." He'd told himself it was better this way, cleaner, that she deserved someone who could put her first. He'd thrown himself into work with a vengeance, expanding his company at a pace that shocked even the most aggressive investors. When thoughts of Rose threatened to surface, he buried them under spreadsheets and acquisitions. And he'd succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, building an empire that spanned continents. But somewhere along the way, Nicholas Hale had lost something essential, something he hadn't even realized was missing until he looked into the blue eyes of a little girl who shared his blood. Nick. Rose's voice pulled him back to the present. She stood before him, her waitress apron gone, a small purse clutched in her hand. She looked tired but composed, the years having added a maturity to her beauty that made his chest ache with regret. "Where's Lily?" he asked, looking past her. "My neighbor picks her up when I work late shifts. She's at home with her." Rose hesitated. "I thought it would be better if we talked alone first." Nick nodded, standing. The restaurant had emptied considerably in the past hour, the dinner rush giving way to a quieter ambiance. "My car's outside." Rose shook her head. "There's a park across the street. Let's walk." He followed her out into the cool evening air, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. The park was small but well kept, with benches arranged around a central fountain that glimmered in the streetlights. They sat side by side, not quite touching, the sound of cascading water filling the silence between them. "Why didn't you tell me?" Nick finally asked, his voice controlled despite the storm raging inside him. Rose stared at the fountain, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the park lights. "I told you. I tried at first. I called your office multiple times." "And?" She turned to face him fully now. "Your assistant, Victoria, I think her name was, she told me you were unavailable, that you'd made it clear you didn't want personal distractions during your expansion phase." Rose's voice held no accusation, just a weary acceptance. "After the third call, she told me that any further attempts to contact you would be considered harassment." Nick felt as if he'd been struck. Victoria had been his right hand during those critical early years, efficient, ruthless, and completely dedicated to his success. Had she really gone that far to protect him from distractions? "I never gave her those instructions," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "Didn't you?" Rose asked quietly. Maybe not explicitly, but Nick, You made it very clear what your priorities were when you left." He couldn't argue with that. He had chosen his empire over everything else, over everyone else, over Rose, and now, it seemed, over his own daughter. "I didn't know you were pregnant when I left," he said, a desperate edge to his voice. "If I had known—" "Would it have changed anything?" Rose interrupted, her question hanging in the night air between them. And that was the question that cut to the heart of everything, wasn't it? Would knowing about a child have altered the trajectory he'd been so determined to follow? 5 years ago, would he have been capable of being the father Lily deserved? "I don't know," he admitted, the rare honesty painful in his throat. "But I deserved the chance to try." Rose's shoulders sagged slightly as if releasing a burden she'd carried for too long. "Yes," she said softly. "Maybe you did. But Nick, it wasn't just about you. I had to think about what was best for Lily." "And you decided that not having a father was best for her?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "I decided that having a father who might resent her for derailing his ambitions would be worse than having no father at all." Rose's eyes glistened in the dim light. Was I wrong? The question struck him with the force of absolute truth. Would he have resented the responsibility? The constraint on his freedom to build his empire? He wanted to deny it immediately, to insist he would have embraced fatherhood completely. But the Nick of 5 years ago had been a different man, a man consumed by ambition and the need to prove himself. "I don't know," he repeated, the admission costing him dearly. "But that was then. This is now. And now I want to know my daughter." Rose studied him, perhaps searching for the ruthless businessman ready to use his power and resources to get what he wanted. Instead, she found something she hadn't expected: vulnerability, and the raw, unmistakable pain of a father who had just discovered what he had lost. "Okay," she said finally, "but we do this my way, Nick. Slowly. Lily comes first. Her feelings, her comfort. This isn't a business negotiation where you can force terms and deadlines." Nick wanted to object, to assert control as he always did. But this wasn't a boardroom, and Rose wasn't an opponent to be conquered. This was his daughter's life, his daughter, who didn't even know who he was yet. "Your way," he agreed, the words unfamiliar on his tongue. "For Lily." As they sat in silence, the fountain's gentle music washing over them, Nick felt something shift inside him, the first tremor of a fundamental change that would shake the very foundations of the empire he had built. Nick's footsteps echoed through the marble lobby of Hale Enterprises the next morning, his mind still replaying his conversation with Rose. Employees scattered from his path, sensing something different in their CEO's demeanor. The usual cool confidence had been replaced by a barely contained storm. His blue eyes, Lily's eyes, were sharp as glass as he bypassed the elevator that would take him to his penthouse office and instead headed straight for the executive suite on the 38th floor. Victoria Chen had been his executive assistant for 7 years, rising alongside him as he built his company from promising startup to global powerhouse. She managed his life with terrifying efficiency, anticipating needs, eliminating distractions, and protecting his time with the ferocity of a lioness guarding her cubs. He had valued these qualities above all else, until now. She looked up from her immaculate desk as he approached, her professional smile freezing as she registered his expression. "Mr. Hale, I wasn't expecting you until—" "My office, now." He continued past her without breaking stride. Victoria followed swiftly, tablet in hand, the click of her heels against the floor matching the pounding of his heart. As soon as the heavy door closed behind them, he turned to face her. 5 years ago, did a woman named Rose Carter try to contact me?" Victoria's expression didn't change, but Nick caught the almost imperceptible stiffening of her shoulders. He had negotiated with the sharpest minds in business long enough to recognize when someone was calculating their response. "I would need to check the records for that time period," she said smoothly. "The name doesn't immediately ring a bell." Nick's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Don't, Lieutenant. To me." Something in his voice, perhaps the barely controlled fury or perhaps the hurt beneath it, made Victoria's professional mask slip for just a moment. "You were in Tokyo," she said finally. "It was the Matsuno deal, the one that opened the Asian market for us." "And?" Victoria straightened, her chin lifting slightly. "And you had given me explicit instructions to filter all personal matters. You said, and I quote, 'Nothing gets through unless it's directly related to our expansion.' Nothing. She was pregnant with my child." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and accusing. Victoria's eyes widened slightly, the first genuine surprise he had seen from her in years. "I didn't know that," she said, her voice quieter now. "She never specified why she needed to reach you, just that it was personal and urgent. And you decided that wasn't important enough to pass along." "I was doing my job," Victoria countered, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "The job you hired me to do. You were meeting with investors who wouldn't have looked twice at us if they thought you were distracted by personal drama. You needed absolute focus." "That wasn't your decision to make." Nick's voice rose, echoing off the glass walls of his office. Outside, he could see heads turning, conversations halting mid-sentence. He didn't care. "Everything I've done has been for this company," Victoria said, gesturing around them. "For your vision. Do you think we would be where we are today if I had let every personal matter interrupt your focus? If I had let her derail everything you were building?" "Derail?" The word tasted bitter on his tongue. "My daughter. My own child is what you're talking about derailing my precious focus." Victoria's face paled slightly. "A child? She has—" "Yes, a daughter, my daughter, 4 years old." Nick moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. 4 years I will never get back. Her first steps, her first words, gone, because you decided I didn't need to know." Victoria swallowed, but to her credit, she held her ground. "I made a judgment call based on what I knew at the time and the instructions you had given me. If I was wrong—" "If?" Nick laughed, the sound harsh and unfamiliar even to his own ears. "There's no if here, Victoria. You kept my child from me." "You chose this company over everything else," she shot back, her composure finally cracking. "Over everyone else. Don't pretend you would have dropped everything and rushed back to play family man. We both know better." Her words struck him like a physical blow because they echoed his own darkest thoughts from the night before. Would he have chosen differently? The Nick of 5 years ago had been so hungry for success, so determined to prove himself. Would he have seen a child as an opportunity, or as an obstacle? "You're fired." The words came out with cold finality. Victoria stared at him. "What?" "Clean out your desk. Security will escort you out." "You can't be serious." She shook her head in disbelief. 7 years, Nick. I've given this company everything." "So have I," he said quietly. "And now I've discovered the cost was too high." Victoria's face hardened. "Fine. Fire me for doing exactly what you wanted me to do. But don't pretend this changes who you are. Don't pretend you would have been any different then." She turned and walked out, her back straight, her dignity intact despite the public dismissal. Nick watched her go, his certainty wavering. Was she right? Would knowing about Lily have changed anything 5 years ago? The question haunted him as he sank into his chair, staring out at the skyline he had conquered. For the first time, the view brought him no satisfaction, just an acute awareness of everything he had sacrificed to sit in this room, above the world but terribly alone. His phone buzzed with a message from Rose. "Lily has a play date at Westside Park at 3. If you want to come." Nick stared at the message, at once eager and terrified. He had built his life on controlling outcomes, on knowing exactly what to say and do in any situation. But how did one begin to be a father to a child who didn't even know you existed? What could he possibly offer Lily that would make up for 4 years of absence? Despite his uncertainties, at precisely 2:45 that afternoon, Nicholas Hale found himself standing at the edge of a neighborhood park, feeling more out of place in his casual clothes than he ever had in the most intimidating boardrooms. He spotted them easily, Rose sitting on a bench watching as Lily climbed a small jungle gym with determined concentration. His daughter was dressed in purple leggings and a bright yellow sweater, her dark curls bouncing as she navigated the bars with careful precision. The sight of her made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Rose noticed him first, offering a small nod. He approached slowly, hyper-aware of how his presence might disrupt the peaceful scene. "You came," Rose said, making room for him on the bench. "Of course." Nick sat down, his eyes never leaving Lily. "Has she... do I..." "She knows someone special is coming to meet her," Rose said quietly. "I told her you're an old friend of mine who wants to get to know her." Nick nodded, grateful for the simple explanation that demanded nothing from Lily, or from him, just yet. "Thank you," he said. Rose gave him a considering look. "You look different." "I fired Victoria this morning." Her eyebrows rose. "Because of what she did." "Because I can't trust her anymore." He paused. "And because she was right about something that I don't want to be true." Before Rose could ask what he meant, Lily spotted him. She paused on top of the jungle gym, studying him with open curiosity before climbing down and running over. "Hi," she said, slightly breathless from play. "Are you Mommy's friend?" Nick felt a lump form in his throat. Up close, the resemblance between them was even more striking. The same blue eyes, the same slight dimple in the left cheek. "Yes," he managed. "My name is Nick." "I'm Lily." She offered her small hand with surprising formality. "I'm 4 3/4." Nick shook her hand gently, marveling at how tiny it was compared to his own. "It's very nice to meet you, Lily." She tilted her head, studying him with the unfiltered curiosity of childhood. "You talk fancy." A startled laugh escaped him. "Do I?" "Uh-huh, like the people in the movies with the crowns." "Royalty," Rose translated with a small smile. "She thinks you sound like royalty." "I'll take that as a compliment," Nick said, smiling at Lily. "Do you want to see me go across the monkey bars?" Lily asked, already bouncing slightly with eagerness to show off her skills. "I can do it all by myself now." "I'd love to," Nick said honestly. He watched as she raced back to the playground, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar pride as she conquered the monkey bars with determined concentration. She was fearless, this daughter of his, strong and certain in a way that reminded him painfully of himself before success had isolated him. "She's amazing," he said softly to Rose. "Yes," Rose agreed. "She is. I've missed so much." Rose's expression softened slightly. "You're here now. That's what matters to her." As they watched Lily play, Nick felt something shift inside him, priorities rearranging themselves without his conscious control. For the first time in years, the constant hum of business concerns faded to background noise, replaced by a single, overwhelming desire to know this small person who carried his blood. He had built an empire with ruthless determination, but sitting on that park bench, watching his daughter play, Nicholas Hale realized he had never created anything as miraculous as her, and he was determined not to lose her again. Over the next 3 weeks, Nick rearranged his entire life around the precious hours he spent with Lily. Board meetings were rescheduled, international calls delegated, and for the first time in his career, Nicholas Hale left the office at 5 o'clock sharp whenever Lily was expecting him. His executive team watched in baffled silence as their famously workaholic CEO began declining weekend strategy sessions in favor of trips to the zoo and puppet shows at the local children's theater. Today, he sat cross-legged on Rose's living room floor, his Italian leather shoes discarded by the door, his suit jacket draped over a chair. Lily knelt across from him, her face scrunched in concentration as she carefully placed another block on their tower. "Careful," he cautioned, holding his breath as the structure wobbled slightly. "I know what I'm doing," Lily informed him with the supreme confidence only a 4-year-old could muster. The tower stabilized, and she sat back with a triumphant smile. "Your turn." Nick studied the precarious construction, analyzing angles and weight distribution as seriously as he would examine acquisition proposals. Lily giggled at his intensity, the sound warming something deep inside him that had been cold for too long. "What's so funny?" he asked, selecting a rectangular block with careful deliberation. "Your thinking face," she explained. "It gets all scrunchy, like this." She demonstrated, pulling her eyebrows together and pursing her lips in an exaggerated frown. "I do not look like that," Nick protested, fighting a smile. "Yes, you do," Rose confirmed from the kitchen doorway where she stood watching them, a dish towel in her hands. "You've always made that face when you're concentrating, even back when—" She trailed off, their shared past still a carefully navigated territory. Their eyes met over Lily's head, and for a moment Nick glimpsed something in Rose's expression that made his heart beat faster, a softening, a remembering. Then Lily's voice broke the moment. "Mommy, Nick's helping me build the tallest tower ever, and then we're going to knock it down." "The destruction is her favorite part," Rose explained, a small smile touching her lips. "Mine too," Nick admitted, surprising himself with the truth of it. There was something liberating about carefully building something just to joyfully demolish it. No consequences, no board members to please, no shareholders to appease. Just pure, simple fun. His phone vibrated in his pocket for the 4th time in 20 minutes. Nick ignored it, focusing instead on placing his block with surgical precision. The tower swayed dangerously but held. "Ha!" he exclaimed, more triumph in his voice than when he'd closed his last billion-dollar deal. Rose's phone rang, and she stepped back into the kitchen to answer it. Nick barely registered her absence, too engrossed in watching Lily contemplate her next move with endearing seriousness. "It's for you," Rose said, returning with her phone extended. "Your office says it's urgent. They've been trying to reach you." Nick frowned, reluctantly taking the phone. "This is Hale," he said, his voice automatically shifting to its business cadence. "Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt," his new assistant stammered, "but Mr. Donovan is here with the board members. They've called an emergency session and are demanding your presence." "Tell them I'm unavailable until tomorrow morning," Nick replied firmly, watching as Lily carefully selected her next block. "Sir, Mr. Donovan specifically said that if you refuse to come in, I should tell you that—" The assistant paused, clearly uncomfortable. "That he knows about your little secret, and that it would be in everyone's best interest if you address the situation personally. Those were his exact words, sir." A cold weight settled in Nick's stomach. Robert Donovan had been his business partner since the early days, brilliant, ruthless, and always watching for leverage. If he knew about Lily— "I'll be there in 30 minutes, Nick said tersely, ending the call and handing the phone back to Rose. "Something wrong?" she asked, her brow furrowing at his expression. "Just business," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "I need to step out for a bit." Lily looked up, disappointment clouding her features. "But what about our tower?" Nick knelt beside her, gently tucking a stray curl behind her ear. The gesture came naturally now, though the first time he'd done it had felt terrifyingly intimate. "I'll be back to help you knock it down, I promise. Save that part for me?" Lily considered this compromise, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, but you have to make the crash sound when it falls." "The crash sound is the most important part," he agreed seriously, his heart twisting as he rose to his feet. Rose followed him to the door, her arms crossed protectively across her chest. "Nick, what's going on?" He hesitated, not wanting to worry her but needing her to be prepared. "It might be nothing, but if it's what I think, someone at my company may have found out about Lily." Rose paled slightly. "And that's bad because in my world, people use whatever leverage they can find." He kept his voice low, glancing back to make sure Lily was still focused on the tower. "I need to handle this before it becomes a problem." "You're scared," Rose observed, surprise evident in her voice. In all the years she'd known him, fear had never been an emotion she'd associated with Nicholas Hale. "Not scared," he corrected, though the tightness in his chest suggested otherwise. "Just protective." Rose's expression softened. "Go, do what you need to do. We'll be here." Nick nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. He had always fought his battles alone, but now he was fighting for more than just himself, for Lily, and maybe, in some way, he wasn't ready to fully acknowledge for Rose, too. The Hale Enterprises boardroom fell silent as Nick strode in, his face a composed mask that revealed nothing of the turmoil beneath. 10 pairs of eyes tracked his movement to the head of the table where Robert Donovan stood, a tablet in his hands and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nick, so glad you could join us," Donovan said, his voice carrying just the right note of professional concern. "We were beginning to worry." "Cut the crap, Robert," Nick replied evenly, remaining standing. "Why the emergency session?" A few board members shifted uncomfortably, but Donovan's smile only widened. "We've been reviewing the company's trajectory since your recent changes in priorities." He tapped his tablet, and the wall screen illuminated with a graph showing a slight but noticeable downward trend. 3 canceled investor meetings, a postponed expansion announcement, decisions being delegated that you would normally handle personally. "And yet, our quarterly projections are still on target," Nick countered, "as you all received in last week's report." "For now," Donovan conceded, "but there's a more concerning pattern emerging." He swiped his tablet again, and a new image appeared on the screen, a photograph of Nick at the park with Lily, her small hand in his as they stood by the swings. Nick's blood ran cold, but his expression remained impassive. "Is there a point to this invasion of privacy?" "Privacy is a luxury afforded to private citizens," Donovan replied smoothly, "not to the CEO of a publicly traded company whose personal decisions impact thousands of employees and millions in shareholder value." He turned to address the board. "Nicholas has apparently discovered he has a child. A charming development on a personal level, of course, but as his business partner and as your chief operations officer, I have to question whether this distraction is in the best interest of the company." "My personal life has no bearing on my ability to lead this company," Nick stated, his voice dangerously quiet. "Doesn't it?" Donovan challenged. "You've missed more meetings in the past month than in the previous 5 years combined. You've delegated key decisions to subordinates who lack your strategic vision. You're clearly compromised." "Careful, Robert." The warning in Nick's tone was unmistakable. Donovan set down his tablet, leaning forward with his palms flat on the polished table. "The board has the right to know if their CEO's focus has shifted, particularly when it appears you've been hiding a secret family." "I haven't been hiding anything," Nick said, directing his words to the board members rather than Donovan. "I recently discovered I have a daughter. I've been taking time to establish a relationship with her. That's all." "A relationship that conveniently began right after the Westridge acquisition fell through," Donovan pointed out. "An acquisition you normally would have secured with your eyes closed." One of the older board members, Janet Farrell, spoke up. "Robert, I fail to see how Mr. Hale's family situation impacts our quarterly performance." "It's not just about performance," Donovan insisted. "It's about stability and focus. Nick built this company on his legendary dedication and single-minded focus. Now, suddenly, he's leaving at 5 o'clock to play house with a child he never cared about before. Nick's control slipped for just a second, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? Donovan's eyes glittered with the satisfaction of having struck a nerve. I think the real question here, the question the board should be asking, is whether Nicholas Hale is still the right person to lead this company through its next phase of growth, or whether his divided attentions suggest it might be time for new leadership. And there it was, the threat laid bare. Donovan wasn't just questioning Nick's commitment, he was making a play for control, using Lily as the wedge to drive between Nick and the empire he had built. The room fell silent, everyone aware of the power struggle unfolding before them. Nick looked around the table at the board members, some concerned, some calculating, all waiting to see how he would respond to this direct challenge. In that moment, with his professional future hanging in the balance, Nick found himself thinking not of stock prices or market share, but of a little girl patiently waiting for him to return and help her knock down a tower of blocks, of the promise he had made to be there for that simple, joyous destruction. For the first time in his career, Nicholas Hale realized he might have something to lose more precious than his company. And, for the first time, he wasn't entirely sure which he would choose if forced to decide. Nick stood perfectly still in the boardroom, the silence stretching taut as a wire. The faces around the table watched him expectantly, some with sympathy, others with barely concealed calculation. This was the moment when Nicholas Hale would typically launch a devastating counteroffensive, leveraging his authority and strategic brilliance to neutralize any threat. But the man who had built an empire through sheer force of will found himself at an unexpected crossroads. The image of Lily's tower of blocks kept flashing in his mind, alongside the memory of her small hand in his. "You're right about one thing, Robert," Nick finally said, his voice quiet but steady. "My priorities have changed." Donovan's expression flickered with surprise before settling into smug satisfaction. "Then, you admit—" "I admit," Nick interrupted, "that discovering I have a daughter has transformed how I see the world, including this company." He straightened, addressing the entire board now. "I built Hale Enterprises to last generations, not to satisfy quarterly projections. If taking a few hours each week to know my child makes me unfit to lead in your eyes, then perhaps we have different visions for what this company should be." Janet Farrell leaned forward. "Are you suggesting you're willing to step down, Mr. Hale?" "I'm suggesting," Nick replied, "that I won't be blackmailed into choosing between my company and my family." He turned his gaze back to Donovan. "Not by you, not by anyone." Donovan's smile hardened. "Noble sentiments. But this isn't about blackmail, it's about fiduciary responsibility. You founded this company on the principle that nothing matters more than results. Now suddenly you're arguing for work-life balance." He laughed shortly. "The Nick Hale I know would fire anyone who tried to use family as an excuse for decreased performance." The accusation stung because it contained a kernel of truth. The old Nick would have seen any personal attachment as weakness, as a distraction from the single-minded pursuit of success. "Perhaps," Nick conceded, "I was wrong about what truly matters." A ripple of murmurs passed through the board members. Nicholas Hale admitting he was wrong about anything was unprecedented. "This is exactly what concerns me," Donovan pressed his advantage. "You're not thinking like the CEO we need anymore. You're thinking like a father." He imbued the word with subtle disdain. Nick felt something shift inside him, a certainty crystallizing through the doubt. "Yes, I am. And that doesn't make me weaker, Robert. It gives me something more important to build than just profit margins." He placed his palms on the table, leaning forward. "I will continue to lead this company with the same dedication I always have. But I will also be a father to my daughter. If the board feels these two roles are incompatible, I'm prepared to accept your decision." The statement hung in the air, its implications clear. Nick was calling their bluff, daring them to oust the visionary founder whose name was on the building. "Perhaps," Janet Farrell said carefully, "we're being hasty. Mr. Hale's performance metrics remain exceptional, even with his adjusted schedule. I move that we table this discussion and revisit it at our quarterly review." Several board members nodded in agreement, relief evident on their faces. Few had the appetite for a public battle with the company's founder and figurehead. Donovan's jaw tightened, but he recognized when tactical retreat was necessary. "Fine. Tabled for now, but this conversation isn't over, Nick." "No," Nick agreed coolly. "It's not." As the board members filed out, Donovan lingered, waiting until they were alone. "Family makes you vulnerable," he said quietly. "It gives people leverage over you. I thought I taught you that lesson years ago." The comment hit Nick like a physical blow as long-buried memories surfaced. Robert had been his mentor in the early days, showing him how to navigate the cutthroat world of high finance. His most repeated lesson: attachments are liabilities. "You taught me a lot of things, Robert," Nick replied. "Not all of them were right." Donovan's expression hardened. "Sentiment will cost you everything you've built, and when it does, I'll be here to pick up the pieces." He paused at the door. "Just like I did with your father's company." The parting shot landed with precision, opening old wounds Nick had long thought healed. His father, brilliant but ultimately destroyed by his refusal to sacrifice his principles for profit. The comparison was deliberate and cutting. Nick remained in the empty boardroom after Donovan left, staring out at the city sprawled below. The empire he had built gleamed in steel and glass, but for the first time, it felt hollow compared to the simple joy of building block towers with his daughter. His phone chimed with a message from Rose. "Lily's asking when you're coming back for the tower demolition." "Everything okay?" The simple text anchored him, pulling him back from the precipice of doubt. Whatever cost his choice might exact professionally, he wouldn't, be an absent father. Not now that he knew what he had been missing. "On my way," he texted back. "Tell her to get ready for the biggest crash sound ever." When Nick returned to Rose's apartment, Lily was curled up asleep on the couch, the block tower still standing in patient witness to his broken promise. Rose met him at the door, concern evident in her expression. "She tried to wait up for you," she explained softly. "Said the tower demolition wouldn't be the same without your crash sound." Guilt twisted in Nick's chest as he looked at his sleeping daughter, her dark curls spilling across the cushion. "I'm sorry. The meeting took longer than expected." Rose studied his face. "Do you want to talk about it?" Nick hesitated, then nodded, following Rose to the small kitchen where they could speak without waking Lily. Rose poured 2 mugs of tea, a domestic gesture that felt both foreign and comforting. "My business partner is making a play for control of the company," Nick explained, keeping his voice low, "using my relationship with Lily as leverage." Rose's eyes widened. How did he even find out about her? "Had me followed, apparently." Nick's jaw tightened. Robert has always believed in knowing everyone's vulnerabilities. And he sees Lily as your vulnerability. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Nick stared into his tea. "He's not entirely wrong. Before Lily, the company was everything. I had nothing to lose." "And now?" Rose asked quietly. "Now I have everything to lose." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. Rose was silent for a moment, then said, "I got a job offer today." Nick looked up sharply. "What kind of offer?" "Teaching position, elementary school art program." She took a deep breath. "In Portland." Portland, over 1,000 miles away. The distance hit Nick like a physical blow. "You're considering it?" "It's a good opportunity. Better pay, benefits." She hesitated. A fresh start, maybe. For you and Lily. The words felt like ashes in his mouth. Rose nodded slowly. We've been managing on my waitressing income, but this would give Lily more stability, better schools. I can provide for her, Nick said immediately. You know that. Whatever you need, whatever she needs. It's not just about money, Nick, Rose interrupted gently. It's about what kind of life we build for her, what kind of future. And you don't see that future here? With ... He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Rose's expression softened. 3 weeks ago, you didn't even know she existed. And now you're making promises about the future? You have a company to run, an empire to protect. How does Lily fit into that world? I'll make her fit, Nick insisted, a desperate edge to his voice. I'll change whatever I need to change. Will you? Rose challenged, though her voice remained gentle. When your board forces you to choose between being a CEO and being a father, which will you pick? The question echoed his own internal struggle, the very choice Donovan was trying to force upon him. Before he could answer, a small voice interrupted from the doorway. Daddy! They both turned, startled. Lily stood there in her pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes, the word she had used hanging in the air between them all. Rose recovered first. Lily, sweetie, what are you doing up? I heard voices. Lily looked directly at Nick. Are you my daddy? For real? Nick's heart stuttered in his chest. They had been so careful, introducing him simply as Nick, allowing Lily to adjust to his presence without the pressure of their biological connection. But children absorbed more than adults gave them credit for. He glanced at Rose, seeking guidance, but her expression was unreadable. This moment, this question, was his alone to navigate. Slowly, Nick knelt down to Lily's level, meeting her sleepy blue eyes. His eyes, directly. Yes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I am. Lily considered this information with solemn intensity. Is that why you look like me? And why you make the thinking face like I do? A surprised laugh escaped him. Yes, that's why. Oh. Lily nodded, as if this simply confirmed something she had already figured out. Where were you before? The innocent question cut deeper than any boardroom accusation. Nick struggled to find words simple enough for a 4-year-old to understand, yet honest enough to honor the gravity of the moment. I was lost, he said finally, for a long time, but I found you now, and I'm not going anywhere. Lily seemed to weigh his answer, her small face serious. Then she did something that shattered the last of Nick's defenses. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his neck in an unquestioning embrace. Okay, she said simply, as if it was the most natural thing in the world to accept this man as her father. Over Lily's shoulder, Nick's eyes met Rose's. Tears glistened in her eyes, reflecting his own overwhelmed emotions. In that moment, the choice that had seemed so impossible in the boardroom became crystal clear. Empire or family was no choice at all when holding his daughter in his arms. But as Lily's small body relaxed against him, already drifting back to sleep, the reality of Rose's job offer loomed like a shadow. He might have chosen Lily, but Rose could still choose to take her away, to build a life 1,000 miles from him, a life where he would once again be an outsider looking in. The victory of finding his place in his daughter's heart had never felt more fragile, more at risk, and for the first time in his life, Nicholas Hale had no strategic play, no leverage, no control over the outcome that mattered most. 3 days later, Nick sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by the trappings of success that had once defined him. The skyline stretched before him, a concrete and glass testament to human ambition. On his desk sat 2 documents side by side, a contract transferring controlling interest of Hale Enterprises to a management trust, and a hastily drafted custody agreement that would ensure his place in Lily's life regardless of where Rose decided to build their future. His pen hovered over the company document, the weight of legacy pressing down on him. Signing meant stepping back from daily operations, ceding ground to Donovan and the board. It meant surrendering the identity he had cultivated for a decade, but it also meant freedom. Freedom to be the father that Lily deserved. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. His new assistant appeared in the doorway, her expression hesitant. "There's someone here to see you, Mr. Hale. She doesn't have an appointment, but she insisted it was important." Before Nick could respond, Rose stepped into view behind the assistant. Her presence in his professional domain felt like worlds colliding, the carefully compartmentalized pieces of his life suddenly thrown into chaotic proximity. "It's all right," he told the assistant. "Please give us the room." As the door closed, Rose approached his desk slowly, taking in the panoramic view with quiet appreciation. So, this is where Nicholas Hale built his empire. "Built, and possibly about to surrender," Nick replied, gesturing to the documents before him. Rose's eyes widened slightly. "You're selling the company?" "Restructuring, stepping back from day-to-day operations." He leaned back in his chair, suddenly exhausted. "It turns out empires require constant attention. So do daughters." Rose studied him for a long moment, as if seeing him truly for the first time since their reunion. "You're really choosing her." "There was never any real choice, Rose. Not once I knew she existed." Rose reached into her bag and withdrew a worn leather photo album. "I found this when I was packing up some things. I thought you should see it." Nick accepted the album cautiously, opening it to find faded photographs of a younger Rose alongside an older man with kind eyes and a professor's bearing. "Your father?" Rose nodded. "William Carter. He taught economics at the State University for 30 years. Nick turned the page, and his breath caught. There, in a yellowed newspaper clipping, was a much younger version of himself shaking hands with Rose's father. The caption read, "Professor Carter presents economics scholarship to promising student Nicholas Hale." "I don't understand," Nick said, looking up at Rose in confusion. "This was before we met. You never told me your father was William Carter." "I didn't know it mattered," Rose replied softly. "By the time we met, he had already passed away, and you never mentioned being his student." Nick stared at the photograph, memories flooding back. William Carter, the professor who had seen potential in a scholarship student from the wrong side of town, who had mentored him, challenged him, believed in him when no one else had. "He changed my life," Nick whispered. "I wouldn't be sitting in this office if it weren't for him. He's the reason I—" His voice trailed off as the implication struck him fully. "Lily is his granddaughter." Rose nodded, her eyes glistening. "He would have loved her so much, and I think he would have been proud of who you became, at least the man you're becoming now." The coincidence was too profound to be mere chance, that his mentor's daughter would come into his life years later, that they would create a child together who would ultimately lead him back to the values her grandfather had tried to instill. It felt like the closing of a circle he hadn't known was open. "The Portland job," Nick said suddenly. "Have you decided?" Rose hesitated. "It's a good opportunity. But is it what you really want?" She looked away toward the city sprawled below them. "What I want is security for Lily. A stable home. A future I can count on." "And if you could have those things here?" Nick stood, moving around the desk to stand before her. "Rose, I'm not asking you to trust the man I was 5 years ago. That man wouldn't have deserved your trust. But the man I'm trying to become, the father I'm learning to be, is asking for a chance." Rose met his gaze steadily. "A chance at what, Nick?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither had dared voice aloud. Before Nick could answer, his phone rang, the special tone he had programmed for his private line, the one that only 3 people had access to. "I should take this," he apologized, answering the call. "This is Hale." Rose watched as his expression transformed from annoyance to shock to focused intensity. The color drained from his face as he gripped the edge of his desk. "When?" he demanded. "Which hospital?" "I'll be right there." He ended the call, already reaching for his jacket. "It's Lily," he explained, his voice tight with fear. "She collapsed at preschool. They're taking her to Memorial Hospital." The world narrowed to a tunnel of pure, primal fear. Together they rushed from the office, all discussions of jobs and futures momentarily suspended by the more immediate crisis. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly before them, sterile and unforgiving. Nick paced while Rose spoke quietly with doctors. Words floated through the air. Severe infection. Immune response. Specialized treatment. When Rose returned to the waiting area, her face was drawn with worry. "They need to run more tests, but they think it's a rare form of pneumonia. She'll need specialized treatment, possibly for weeks." "Cost isn't an issue," Nick said immediately. "Whatever she needs, the best specialists, experimental treatments, anything." Rose nodded, too worried to argue about independence or pride. "They're moving her to the pediatric ICU. We can see her in a few minutes." Nick continued pacing, his mind racing through contingencies, solutions, fixes, approaching this crisis as he would any business problem. But this wasn't business. This was Lily, his daughter, and all his wealth and power and strategic brilliance couldn't guarantee her safety. "Nick," Rose said softly, interrupting his thoughts, "you need to breathe." He stopped, realizing how close to the edge he was. "I can't lose her, Rose. Not now. Not when I've just found her." Rose's hand found his, warm and steady despite her own fear. "We won't lose her. She's too stubborn, like her father." The ghost of a smile touched his lips at that. They stood together, united by shared concern for the small life that connected them, until a nurse appeared to escort them to Lily's room. She looked impossibly tiny in the hospital bed, surrounded by monitors and tubes. Her skin was pale, her breathing labored despite the oxygen mask covering her small face. Nick felt his knees weaken at the sight. "Daddy?" Lily's voice was barely audible, her eyes fluttering open as they approached. "I'm here, sweetheart," Nick said, taking her small hand carefully in his. "Mommy and I are both here." "Don't feel good," she murmured, her eyes already drifting closed again. "I know, baby," Rose whispered, stroking her forehead, "but the doctors are going to make you all better." As Lily slipped back into restless sleep, Nick made a decision. The next morning, while Rose dozed in the chair beside Lily's bed, he made a series of calls from the hospital corridor. By noon, he had liquidated his personal stake in Hale Enterprises, surrendering control to the board, but securing enough capital to ensure Lily would have the very best care without draining Rose's savings. It was Donovan who found him in the hospital cafeteria later that day, his face a mixture of triumph and confusion. "You actually did it," he said, taking the seat across from Nick without invitation. "You walked away from everything we built." "Not everything," Nick corrected, his voice steady. "Just the parts that don't matter anymore." Donovan studied him with genuine curiosity. "Was it worth it? Giving up an empire for this?" He gestured vaguely at the hospital surroundings. Nick thought of Lily's small hand in his, of her calling him Daddy for the first time, of the way her face lit up when she laughed. He thought of Rose, her strength and grace, and the second chance he'd never dared hope for. "You still don't understand, do you, Robert?" Nick said quietly. "I haven't given up an empire. I found one worth fighting for." 3 months later, Nick stood in the hospital corridor watching Lily color at a small table. Her strength had returned gradually, like a spring reclaiming winter's barren ground. As she carefully selected a blue crayon, the exact shade of their shared eyes, he felt the weight of the document in his pocket. Final confirmation that Hale Enterprises now belonged to others. Rose appeared beside him, slipping her hand into his with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen him at his weakest and strongest moments. "Regrets?" she asked softly. Nick watched as Lily completed her drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a sun that took up half the page. She had labeled them in her wobbly handwriting, Mommy, Me, and Daddy. "My whole life I built towers just to own the sky," Nick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never realized the view is better from the ground, looking up together." He stepped forward, kneeling beside Lily as she offered him her drawing with the unguarded pride only a child can show. As he took the paper from her small hands, Nick finally understood what his mentor had tried to teach him long ago, that empires of steel and glass crumble, but the kingdom you build in a child's heart stands eternal. And in that kingdom, Nicholas Hale had finally found a throne worth occupying. Don't forget to like this video if you believe in the power of love to break down walls and bridge any divide. Please do comment your feedback and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of family, redemption, and the triumph of love over pride. Remember, it's never too late to change your story.